exploit the software, you just need to basically modify whatever the original developer intended for that software to do. This is done in many different ways we'll talk about throughout the presentation. One example is a drive-by download, which is a very good example, and many of you are familiar with it. So my first question to you is, do you know what a drive-by download is?
They do those in like emails, don't they?
Yep.
Like spam emails?
Yes, basically. So there's many different ways you can do them, but it's a very common attack. It's implemented by fetching your browser. So it starts with somebody placing malicious code in a web server. Once you access that web server, it will download that code into your browser and it will run whatever the code is supposed to be doing. Once you're infected, they basically have control, or I don't know, there's many different codes so they can use to do whatever they want.
Thank you.
This usually happens one of two ways. Like, there's another way, like you said, the email. Common way is by being lured in with an ad that says that you get a free iPhone or $1 million or whatever. Those people click on those. And another way is just by taking over a legitimate website and inserting the malicious code into that website.
So the big part of our presentation was buffer overflow attacks. So I'm going to give you guys a history of the buffer overflow attacks. So first off, it's known as one of the most important exploitation techniques in the history of computer security. It was originally used by Robert Morris Jr. in 1988 to write the first computer worm. Buffer overload attacks, they're still broadly used today. In fact, many researchers, one of them being Van der Veen, he believes that they're going to be in use for many, many years to come, and we'll kind of touch on that near the end of the presentation as well. So, does anyone know what a buffer overflow is? Alright, so buffer overflow basically occurs when a program is writing some type of data onto a buffer, and then it overwrites the buffer boundary. So basically what happens at that point is when it's overrun, when it overwrites the buffer boundary, it causes the data to be overwritten basically onto other memory locations. In most cases, basically the program that's created is a very simple program that's intended to be completely harmless, but most of the time you'll see that they have some type of root or administrative privileges in the code, like it has some type of access to those privileges. So basically this allows any cyber criminal, this is very key because it allows any cyber criminal to have the same administrative / root privileges that you would have had in the software. So can anyone tell me what happens if there is a buffer overflow? Now that you know what one is, Alright. Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I see it.
It starts writing into adjacent memory locations to execute some sort of code.
Well, it definitely does, okay. So we'll go a little bit more in depth. So basically, it's extremely detrimental to the computer and security. So one of the many things that can happen is your data gets corrupted. The second thing that may happen is that the program may crash. And then the last thing, of course, is it allows the execution of malicious code. So people can, when they hack into your code, they'll put their own code in there and it'll execute. So you have a lot of malicious code, your computer doing, or your program doing stuff that you didn't originally intend to do.
Alright, so buffer overflows are pretty complicated. I mean, they sound easy in practice, but they're actually not that simple, so I'll kind of overview one. Basically what happens is when you have a program, you have all the local variables are stored in the stack, and so this is kind of where the stack would be. And so if you had function A, which takes like a character array or something of like 12 characters, that's where they would go. They would go into the local variable space here. And so let's say B is the buffer, which is those 12 characters. So if the programmer or the program did not check that buffer boundary, you could actually put in more characters that were supposed to be there, which would actually override and go into adjacent memories, like you said, and actually cover up your return address. And what the return address is that basically when the function's done executing whatever it's doing, it goes back to the main program to continue. But what you're doing is you're actually changing where it's going to. So you basically override the return address and then you just pump it full of arbitrary code that makes it like give you root access or something. And the program is forced to run it because that program's running from whatever permissions on the host machine, so you basically just completely compromise it. But most things protect against this now, so that is the overview here. So, what happens in a buffer overflow attack?
Anybody know?
All right, glad to see you're paying attention. Basically, the cyber criminal in a buffer overflow attack is able to override a function pointer and return address. This basically allows the attacker to inject the code and have it executed within your program. And basically, this is the major exploit of a buffer overflow. And there's 3 major protection mechanisms that were designed to combat buffer overflow. Are you taking this one, or should I continue?
No, you're good. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Basically, there's 3 major protection mechanisms to combat this. That's stack canaries, which we'll talk about in the next couple slides. Well, actually, all these we'll talk about. But stack canaries, data execution prevention, and address space layout randomization. And yeah, so.
Alright, so the operating system has a couple of protections to keep cyber criminals from taking over your computer. I guess the first here is the stack canaries, and then they basically do the same thing that canaries used to do in mine shafts. So when the canary died in an old mine shaft, everybody was like, alright, time to go. So this does the same thing and tells them when something's wrong before something actually goes wrong. And it essentially prevents the buffer overflow from overriding the return address. And yeah, that's kind of how it works. So it just, when you inject stuff to have the code be run, it checks to see if the canary's been overwritten. If it has been overwritten, it won't run anymore. It will stop the execution of that code. And yeah, that's the same thing. So, anybody know any problems with it? Just off the top of your heads?
Probably not foolproof.
Oh, no protection mechanism.
Well, yeah.
That's pretty accurate. That'd be accurate. Yeah, that'd be correct. Who said that?
So what you can do is, when the stack canary throws an exception, you can overwrite what the handler for that exception does, and then still inject your code and have it run. It's more complicated, but it still works, and it keeps, just makes it way good.
Nah, I think that's him. Very sure it's him.
You're last.
Second to last.
Our next protection is a data execution protection, and it's pretty straightforward. It's just one big issue with buffer overflow is that cyber criminals can just come and just inject code and just exploit the program entirely. But to combat this, they limit the amount of bytes that the attacker can use, and they kind of like have this on-off system of like either having it written or executable, and that's called WX or X.
It's basically, it describes a really important concept that memory is either executable or writable, not both. So it could either be executed or it could be written, but not both, and that really prevents the buffer overflow attacks from happening.
Okay, I'm gonna talk about ASLR, and that stands for American Sign. I'm just messing. It stands for Address Space Layout Randomization. Basically, it was coined by Linux in 01, and it's used in most operating systems. Not necessarily. That's probably on the slide, but not necessarily on. It's usually used mostly on user apps, and that's not necessarily on the kernel per se. It's also really efficient, so it's used pretty well. As it says on the slide, basically it just every time the function or the program is run, it randomizes all the stuff in there, especially in the initial stack or the heap or the libraries. And as it says, it makes it difficult for an attacker to inject some code inside of it, because once it randomizes, they obviously can't find their injection.